Let's talk about completing the square, which is a useful approach for solving quadratic equations because it can solve any quadratic equation, as well as it's an important technique in future classes down the road. It gets used in a lot of different areas and applications, but as well, it's very useful for solving quadratic equations if you're not moving on, as well as it tends to show up a lot on exams. So let's jump into an example and let's solve the following quadratic equation. Let's go with 3x squared plus 18x plus 9 is equal to 0. So for solving a quadratic equation using complete the square, I first want to get it to look like an ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. That's already done in this case. If that wasn't there first, I'd do that first. And then I want to get a leading coefficient of 1. So 3 is currently there, so the first thing I'm going to do is divide both sides by 3. So when I do that on the first term, I get x squared. 18 divided by 3 is 6, so I have a plus 6x, and then 9 divided by 3 is 3, and the right hand is 0, and 0 divided by 3 is still 0. So now I have a leading coefficient of 1. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my new b, so to speak, and I'm going to divide by 2. So 6 divided by 2, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to square it. So this gives me 6 divided by 2 is 3, 3 squared is equal to 9. This is my magic number. This is what I need to have sitting essentially right here for it to be a perfect square. Well, 3 isn't it, so I'm going to move that 3 to the other side, and then I'm going to add 9 to both sides of the equation. So if I add it to one side, I have to add it to the other. Now on the left-hand side, this factors into a perfect square. It's x plus 3 quantity squared. And you can see that because of the practice you've done in factoring so far. And the other way you can do it, it always turns into the x plus b over 2 quantity squared. And the b over 2 is essentially what I had in here, that's 6 over 2. Right-hand side, I have a negative 3 plus 9. That gives me 6. So now, again, my goal is to solve for x. So I'm going to take a square root of both sides of this equation. Left-hand side turns into x plus 3, and anytime you take a square root, there's always a plus or a minus. Square root of 6. Last thing to get x all by itself is subtract 3 from both sides, so I get negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 6 are the solutions to that quadratic equation that I started with. Okay, let's do another example, and this next one is going to have fractions in it. So let's solve the following. Let's go with 6x squared is equal to 2 plus x. So first thing I have to do is get it into the correct form. I'll go with everything on the left-hand side. So 6x squared minus x minus 2 is equal to 0. I need a leading coefficient of 1. Currently there's a 6 here, so I'm going to divide everything by 6. So I get x squared minus 1/6 times x, and then minus 2/6 is the same as 1/3, and 0 divided by 6 is still 0. Now I'm going to take what I have attached to the x, my new b, which is negative 1/6. I'm going to divide by 2, and then I'm going to square it. Dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by 1/2. So this is going to give me a negative 1/12 quantity squared. That should be a positive, and then 12 squared is 144. So 1 over 144 is my magic number. You can see that negative 1/3 is not 1 over 144, so I'm going to move the 1/3 to the other side, so I'll add 1/3 to both sides, and then I'm going to add 1 over 144 to both sides of this equation. So x squared minus 1/6 x plus 1 over 144 is equal to 1/3 plus 1 over 144. Now, unlike the last example, this one is a little harder to see what that left-hand side factors into. It always factors into x plus whatever you have on the inside, that b over 2, which is this right here, which simplified down to negative 1/12. So this inside factors into x minus 1/12, and then there's a quantity squared. Right-hand side, I need a common denominator. That's going to be 144. 3 goes into 144. Let's see. 3 goes into 14 4 times with the 2 left over. And 3 goes into 24 6 times. 8 times. It goes in there 8 times. There we go. So I'm missing essentially 3 times 48 is what I'm missing. So I'm missing a 48 over here, and then I have a plus 1. Always good to get some practice in fractions. So in the end, I get x minus 1/12 quantity squared is equal to 49 over 144. All right, now I'm going to take a square root of both sides, which gives me x minus 1/12 on the left, and on the right I took a square root, so plus or minus, and then the square root of 49, that's a nice number, that's 7, and the square root of 144 is 12. Last thing to do to get x all by itself is to add 1/12 to both sides. So I get x is equal to 1/12 plus or minus 7/12. So there's two options here. Either x is 1/12 plus 7/12 or x is 1/12 minus 7/12. If I do some algebra on that, it looks like x is equal to 1/12 plus 7/12 is 8/12. Or 1/12 minus 7/12 is a minus 6/12, which means if I simplify those, 8 and 12 have a 4 in common, so this first one is 2/3 and minus 1/2. So here are my two options for what x is equal to.